Now, when reading the Old Testament, have you ever wondered why the ancient Israelites had such a major problem? Such a, I guess you could say, a suicidal fixation upon the whole thing with worshiping idols. And of course, to be fair, it wasn't just them. All ancient people back then, no matter what nation, tribe, or tongue, worshipped idols. The sophisticated Egyptians, they worshipped idols. The advanced Babylonians, they too worshipped idols. Everyone back in those days worshipped idols. And when you stop to think about it, there's still a large chunk of the world's population today in, say, countries like India or Thailand, places like that, who will still bow before a mute idol and worship it. Now, to us with a modern Western mindset, steeped both in the Judeo-Christian tradition on the one hand, and then science tradition on the other hand, the whole idea of worshiping an image carved out of wood, fashioned out of metal, chiseled from stone, is a crazy idea. It's absolutely absurd. And yet, for the ancient Israelites, they didn't see the same way we do today. All throughout the Old Testament, the Jewish people struggled with idol worship. We can think, for example, of the bronze snake in Numbers 21. Venomous snakes had come into the camp, Jewish camp in the wilderness, you may remember, biting people. Many of them were dying, so God had Moses make a bronze snake, put it up on a pole, and anyone who was bitten, if they went to that pole and they believed, God would heal them. Pretty amazing. And yet, when we read 2 Kings 18, a few hundred years later, the Israelites had turned that bronze snake on a pole into an idol. They were worshiping it. And what about the favorite Sunday school story that we were all taught about Gideon in the book of Judges? How Gideon's army was vastly outnumbered and against seemingly impossible odds, God gave them victory. Now, we've all heard that story, but in the words of Paul Harvey, do you know the rest of the story? After that, the Israelites, they were pretty amazed, obviously, and they asked Gideon to be their leader, their ruler. But Gideon was like, no, God is to be our ruler. Quite a spiritual thing to say, right? Well, Gideon did have one request. He asked everyone to give them a gold piece of jewelry from the plunder from the defeated armies. And with that, he melted it all down. And the writer of Judges say that he made an idol that was to become a snare for he and his family. Then, of course, there's probably the most famous example of all, the Israelites in the golden calf. Remember while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 commandments, you know, the second commandment, thou shalt not make any graven images, thou shalt not make an idol. That. And after he had been up there for quite a few days, the people down below, they grew sort of impatient. So they approached Aaron, who was second in command, and said, dude, make us something to worship. And so Aaron did the same thing as Gideon. He asked the people to give them some gold jewelry. He melted it down and made the golden calf. And then Moses, when he came down from the mountain with the 2 stone tablets containing the 10 commandments, saw what had took place, he threw them on the ground and smashed them. And he confronted Aaron over what he had done. And Aaron's response is classic. It's something that my children, when they were younger, would have said when they got in trouble. Aaron was like, well, these people, they told me, they gave me this gold, I threw it in the fire, and well, out popped this idol. It's something that you would see in a Monty Python skit. Those are just 3 examples out of many. The Israelites had a major problem with idolatry, but not all of them. There was one man, the prophet Isaiah, who thought that bowing before an idol and asking it to save him was absolutely absurd. And so I want to just quickly look at it this morning. Isaiah chapter 44, verses 12 to 20. I know it's kind of a long chunk, but bear with me. I'll try to be as animated as possible. The blacksmith, and notice the irony here, the sarcasm he uses. The blacksmith takes a tool and works with it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. He gets hungry. He loses strength. He drinks no water and grows faint. The carpenter measures a line and makes an outline with a marker. He roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compasses. He shapes it in human form in all its glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars, or perhaps a cypress or oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. It is used as fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread, but he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. He also says to himself, I am warm. I see fire. From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, save me, you are my God. They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so that they cannot see, and their minds closed so that they cannot understand. No one stops to think. No one has the knowledge or understanding to say, half of it I use for fuel. I even break bread over its coals. I roasted meat and I ate. Shall I make a detestable thing from what is left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood? Such a person feeds on ashes, a deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself or say, is not this thing in my right hand a lie? Now, Isaiah, he lived during roughly around the 7th century BC. He was a contemporary of some other Old Testament prophets. You might remember Amos, Hosea, and Micah, commonly referred to as the so-called minor prophets. And throughout the book of Isaiah makes numerous references to Israel's constant flirtation with idols. To Isaiah, we can see, as well as us, we can clearly see the absurdity of bowing before a block of wood, but not for the vast majority of the Israelites. So over the next few minutes, I want us to look at 3 main points, just 3. What was the reasoning behind idol worship? Number 2, why, in spite of the Israelites being explicitly told, commanded not to worship idols, did they do it? And number 3, what are some idols in our culture today? So to the first point, what was the basic thinking behind idol worship? Well, let me answer by asking you these questions. Why does it rain? Why does the wind blow? Why does the sun shine? Why does the sun rise in the east and set in the west? Why are there illnesses like COVID? Why are there earthquakes? Why does the Nile River, flood its banks every year? Now, as 21st century people, I can pretty much guarantee how you would answer that. Why does it rain? Well, it's called the water cycle. The sun heats up the water down here on the ground. It evaporates. It rises, it floats up into the sky. It begins to condense in the colder air. It returns back into a liquid form. It forms clouds, and then eventually gravity pulls it all back down in the form of rain. Why are there illnesses? Well, viruses, bacteria, stuff like that. Why are there earthquakes? Well, it's because there are these giant tectonic plates beneath our feet, many miles down, that are rubbing against each other, and every once in a while they move quite quickly, and we get an earthquake. In other words, how we would, as 21st century modern people, explain those phenomenon would be in some sort of a scientific manner. We would point to natural laws that govern our world. Now, that's not to say that the Almighty can't tinker with the system if he so chooses. But by and large, we recognize that God allows our world to operate by natural laws. But here's the thing. The people in the ancient world, they didn't have science. Science is just a recent thing in the history of humanity. They didn't appeal, nor did they even know that there were such things as natural laws that govern our world. Instead, they thought in supernatural terms. They thought in terms of spiritual laws. And that is a key in understanding why people worshipped idols. Without a scientific understanding, they would have thought that rain, earthquakes, illnesses, all of that were caused by the gods. Many, many gods. So many gods, in fact, that the average person like you and I couldn't keep track of them, nor could we even possibly know what all these gods and goddesses wanted, the rites and the rituals that they demanded. And so the whole priestly class was developed, who their full-time job was to figure that out for everyone else. And these deities, it seemed, were more often than not very fickle, cruel, and temperamental. Appeasing them was paramount to the ancient mind. And one very important way, one vital way in appeasing these gods was to make an idol. Because it was believed that after an idol was made, the god or goddess would literally come down into this idol and dwell in there. So if you were a person back then and you were going to go somewhere for a few days out of town, you would take your idol with you because that was your god. Your god was in your right hand, so to speak. Idol worship was an integral and fundamental part in the whole religious worldview back then. You would be foolhardy not to worship idols. So that was the basic thinking behind idol worship, point number one. Point number two now is, why did the Israelites, in spite of being clearly commanded not to worship idols, worship idols? I mean, it's not as though God hadn't clearly spelled it out over and over and over again in Scripture. Don't worship idols. And yet they did. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the second commandment of the 10 Commandments was, don't make and worship any graven images. Don't worship idols. How much clearer can you get than that? So, why was that? Why was it, in spite of God being so clear about not worshiping idols, did the Israelites worship idols? Why couldn't they see, as the prophet Isaiah said, that the idol in their right hand was a lie? How could they bow down to a block of wood and not recognize that it was just a block of wood? Well, one reason, I suppose, was fear. Not participating in idol worship required a lot of faith back then. Idol worship was intertwined with the whole polytheistic worldview, religious worldview back then, that there were many, many gods who needed to be appeased, who demanded to be worshipped via idols. But for the Jewish people, remember the first of the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. The Hebrew religion was monotheistic, the belief in only one God. But all the nations around Israel believed and worshipped countless deities, with each god or goddess being in control of some aspect of your life or some aspect of nature, whether it was the rain god, the fertility goddess, or what have you. And one thing that you did not want to do, one thing that you dare not do, was offend one of these easily offendable deities. For it was believed they would take their wrath out, not just on you, but your family, your friends, your neighbors, your community, maybe even go so far as your entire nation. So the Jewish belief in only one God who forbade idol worship was much more than, to the ancient people, a silly, quaint idea. It was a very dangerous idea. Anyone who dared not worship idols was a threat to their community. There was also another reason why the ancient Israelites struggled with idols. It came down to carnal desires, fleshly desires. The Jewish religion was very socially conservative, as is Christianity. But all the other religions around Israel at that time, they were extremely carnal, extremely liberal. If you think things are bad today when you turn on the TV, the nudity that you'll see, nothing compared to the ancient world. For example, there was temple prostitution. It played a big role in religious rites back then. Israel, like all the other nations around, was an agricultural society, mostly made up of farmers. And so, if you were a farmer and you wanted to curry the goddess of fertility her favor, well, you would go spend a night or two with the temple prostitutes. You could see how appealing that would be to men, at least. I've often wondered what the conversation must have been like back then, with a farmer saying to his wife, "Well, I'm off, honey. I'm off to worship the god of fertility, and don't stay up. I'll be home late." "Oh, that's great, honey. I love you. Don't forget to say a prayer for me." Bizarre. So, no doubt, idol worship and the ritual and rites of the pagan religions was very appealing. Okay, so we've looked at the thought process behind idol worship. We've seen basically why it was so hard for the Israelites not to worship idols. And the third thing is that we're going to briefly look at what are some of our modern idols today. Now, I must confess that as I was preparing this sermon, it kind of caught me off guard as I began to contemplate, well, okay, what are idols, some of our idols today? Because I know the standard, almost cliche, if you were to ask people, what are our idols today? Well, an idol is anything that you place above God. Anything that you value above God. Which, of course, is true. You know, we would point to an idol could be a material thing like a car, a house. It could be money. It could be a successful job or what have you. But I think that's really just scratching the surface. Idol worship in ancient times involved much more than just people and material things. The worship of idols involved accepting entire worldviews, different modes of thinking that completely contradicted what God's people were to believe. Perhaps one idol today is the worship of the here and now. That the most important thing is for you to be happy in this life. Focus on you. Be true to yourself. You can't love others until you learn to love yourself. Find yourself. But that's not what Jesus taught. Jesus didn't teach that we were to find ourselves. Rather, he taught that we were to lose ourselves and find him instead. But another form of idol worship today that really is concerning is something that has suddenly become quite prevalent in our culture in just the past few years, and the demands for its worship is becoming more shrill all the time. It boils down to the question of what is a good person. In our Western culture, the idea, at least, of being a good person was that you were honest, you were civil, you were self-controlled, you showed tolerance to those who disagreed with you. A good person was someone who was able to bite their tongue in a heated debate, dealing with some hot social or political topic. A good person was treating others how you would like to be treated. But in just the past few years, things have completely flipped. Things have completely switched. To be viewed as a good person today is how outraged you can appear to others, by showing how righteous you are by denouncing the vice of others, by how hysterical you can get over the latest outrage that the media says that you need to get hysterical over. For example, there's numerous viral videos right now on social media like YouTube of young women completely unhinged, crying and screaming hysterically into the camera over some social issue that they probably don't have a clue about. Yet here's the thing. These young women, it's not as though they were secretly filmed with someone's iPhone and they posted it. No, these young women were doing it themselves, posting it online, thinking that was what a good person is. How could someone possibly think that that is good and acceptable behavior. Well, that's what young people are being taught these days on how to be a good, virtuous person. We've all heard the expression recently, silence equals violence. If you're not there expressing your outrage over something, then you're guilty, you're complicit with the oppressors. For many younger generations, this sort of bizarre behavior is increasingly becoming the new normal, where hate, anger, and outrage are now seen as proof of how loving, compassionate, and caring you are. But as Christians, that is not how we are to behave. We are not to bow before that idol. We are to bow before Christ. And while Christ certainly commanded us to care for, to defend, to speak out for the oppressed, let's not forget, he also said that we are to love our enemies. We are to love the oppressors. Remember Jesus, he received a lot of flack in his day for going to the homes of the tax collectors. Talk about oppressors back in those days. They were the epitome of the oppressors, and yet Jesus went and preached the gospel to them because God loves everyone, the oppressed and the oppressor. Increasingly, as Christians, more so the younger generations, we find ourselves in the same dilemma as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced in the book of Daniel. Bow before that golden image or else. Pray for your children, your grandchildren, and even maybe for some of you, your great-grandchildren. Idol worship is coming back in our culture today, and the young will need all the prayers that they can get. In the coming days, it will take a tremendous amount of moral courage not to bow before the new idols of our age. Thank you.